Today, we're going to discuss Tulsi Gabbard and her prospects as a candidate for the 2020 Democratic primary. And this is someone who I find to be very interesting. She is different than all the other politicians in the field, and I believe that if certain conditions are met, then she could end up becoming an unstoppable force. Not to mention that because of her relative youth, she will still be a viable candidate for the next 2 or 3 decades. So, before we dive into talking about Tulsi Gabbard and her appeal to the progressive wing, I'd first like to just announce this will be the last candidate that I plan to cover in this series. If someone else comes to my attention, I didn't originally plan to do either Sherrod Brown or Mitch Landrieu, so I'm open to new ideas. But if someone else comes to my attention, I'll make a video about them. However, after this point, I will only be making update videos about this topic as conditions change or people drop out or whatever. So the future videos will not be focused on a single politician, but rather on the race in general. And my other politics videos will diverge from this topic of the 2020 election, as I think that there are plenty of other more interesting things to talk about. So without any further ado, let's look at Tulsi Gabbard. Due to Tulsi Gabbard's age, she just turned 37 a couple weeks ago, you might think that she would have a very short and thin resume. However, she's actually been engaged in electoral politics ever since she first became eligible almost. She was elected to the Hawaii House of Representatives starting in 2002 and served 1 term. And at age 21, she became the youngest woman to be elected to a state legislature at the time. Apparently, someone has broken that record since. As a member of the Hawaii National Guard, which I believe she joined in 2003 or 4, Tulsi was actually deployed to Iraq in 2004 and 5, and then deployed again to Kuwait in 2008 and 9. And she currently holds the rank of major within the Hawaii National Guard, and she is still in service. She holds the distinction of being the first Samoan American and also the first Hindu to serve in Congress. And some people have commented that in her early career, she came across as being relatively socially conservative. And we'll come back to that later, since that's actually something which, while on the surface it might appear to be a liability, may prove to be a strength if the political mood of 2020 ends up being what I suspect it will be. Charisma is an X factor in politics which is pretty hard to quantify, but it's pretty apparent that it can put a person over the top even when they are equal to or slightly inferior to their opponent. In Tulsi Gabbard's case, I feel like she has a pretty clear advantage in charisma over all of her opponents. And one interesting thing about her is that no one, even her detractors, have denied the level of her charm. She has good looks. Obviously, a lot of people have noted that. Joe Rogan was creeping on her in some interview with, I think, Kyle Kalinske, where they were looking at photos of her, and he was pretty smitten. I think he wanted her to be president just so he could look at her. So I think that between her good looks and her charm, she exceeds any other politician in those regards, and that is a factor that you can't simply overlook. A lot of people might turn out to vote for her over someone else who's comparable simply because they like her, or they think she's hot. And if you think I'm kidding about they would vote for her because they think she's hot, there were quite a few women in 1960 who voted for JFK over Nixon, not because of his policies, but because they thought that he was much more attractive. So it is possible that this could happen, but it would be the opposite, where men vote for her because she's attractive. She also seems to have a certain sway with random right-wingers that I don't really understand. There's nothing on her resume which makes her look like a right-winger. Now, early in her career, she was more socially conservative than most Hawaii politicians. She was opposed to gay marriage until 2012. But especially since, she hasn't really done anything that points to her being conservative in any meaningful way. And the only thing I can figure is that because she's against certain free trade deals, maybe that's what Steve Bannon is latching on to, and that's why he thinks that she's awesome and really wanted to work with her. I don't know. But it might also just be that he thinks that she's hot. That's always a possibility. And back when she was initially elected to Congress in 2012, Rachel Maddow said about Tulsi Gabbard that she is on the fast track to becoming very famous. And of course, this was before Tulsi, turned on Hillary Clinton and endorsed Bernie Sanders. And I doubt Maddow has mentioned Tulsi Gabbard by name since then, unless it was to attack her over Syria. At any rate, another factor that we can't ignore is that there are already groups and memes calling for Tulsi to run in 2020. And there are only a handful of other people who have that distinction. Bernie Sanders and Nina Turner being the only two. However, I haven't seen any indication that Nina Turner is going to run, so I haven't included her in this list. But with Tulsi, when I typed in Tulsi Gabbard 2020, there's already a community dedicated to that cause. So I feel like her charisma has really caught on, and people on the left know who she is and are pretty enamored with her. Let's take a look at Tulsi Gabbard's progressive credentials. So she first achieved national attention when she left the DNC, where she was serving as a vice chair, in order to endorse Bernie Sanders. And she basically said that the reason she left is because the DNC was corrupt and that the fix was in to elect Hillary, and she did not want to be a part of that because she wanted Bernie Sanders to be the nominee, since she agreed with him, especially on foreign policy. And we'll come back to that. This is something that Tulsi Gabbard has been extremely consistent on. And the fact that consistency helped Bernie Sanders so much in 2016 and was a thorn in the side for Hillary in both the primary and the general makes me think that consistency will also be valued in 2020, even if it's not quite as valued. But the fact that Tulsi was willing to endorse Bernie, whereas other so-called progressives, including Elizabeth Warren and Sherrod Brown, endorsed Hillary, this could be something that really speaks in her favor and makes her appear to be a stronger candidate and someone who is more personally trustworthy. Tulsi also has a criminal justice reform plan that she came up with, and this includes the federal decriminalization of marijuana. It might even include recreational legalization. But at any rate, this is something that she's put thought into, and it's sort of her original idea. So in that way, like Bernie Sanders, not only is she a progressive, but she doesn't necessarily rely on other people to come up with ideas for her. She puts forward her own ideas. So I think that's pretty important, and that would be a marked contrast with someone like a Donald Trump, who doesn't have any ideas at all. So pretty big difference there. Tulsi is also very consistent and very strong on environmental issues. She went in person to Standing Rock, which is something that not many other politicians did. So that is also another thing that will really appeal to progressives, since she is willing to put her money where her mouth is, as it were. And another thing that I think will appeal to a lot of progressives and maybe to Democrats and independents as a whole is that Tulsi Gabbard is pretty unorthodox. She started out as a social conservative, as I pointed out, and she has migrated left on her own, and she's often taken stances that have put her at odds with the party. So she basically left being groomed as a major leader in the DNC leadership and went her own way. So she kind of does what she feels is right. And right now, if we look at people who are really prominent, like Bernie Sanders, who just has done what he wants and has basically bucked the Democratic Party, that's something that will play in her favor. And the fact that she's not just a straight line, run-of-the-mill progressive, that she has a few little things where she deviates from everyone else, I think that will make her stand out and make her seem a lot more genuine and more, unique, original, and more representing a real change, not returning to something from the past, not just swinging the pendulum back, but going to something completely new. I think that she has that appeal because of the way that she's unorthodox and that she has bucked authority. As we'll get into more in a minute, Tulsi Gabbard is a staunch enemy of the establishment, and they absolutely hate her, so they are going to be looking to smear her and try to bring her down. The thing is, however, they will find that she is harder to hit than they think. So one thing establishment Democrats really like to do is to smear their opponents on the basis of identity politics. One of their favorite angles of attack is that if someone is an old white guy, they must be racist and sexist. Well, Tulsi's not old, she's not white, and she's not a man. So that will all prove to be very difficult. It'll be interesting to see how they try to adapt. I think they'll probably go for age, and that would backfire since they're trying to win young voters. They can't really do that. So it'll be interesting to see what they try to go with. Also, usually if someone is a peace candidate, then they will be smeared as being either naive, unrealistic, cowardly, something like that. But with Tulsi Gabbard, she has been deployed to a combat zone, something that none of her opponents can claim. So it will be interesting to see her opponents try to smear her as being naive. If they try that, and they probably will, it most likely will backfire and make them look like complete jokes. Another thing is that one thing the establishment likes to do is to run candidates who represent a group that has never held an office before. So, for instance, Hillary Clinton's campaign was all about being the first female president. Tulsi Gabbard can also be the first female president, since Hillary did not get elected. The thing is, she's already made history, and she has a proven track record of being able to be a first. She was the youngest woman ever in a state legislature, and she was also the first Samoan American to be in Congress. And I think that she understands, based on her political leaning so far and the way that she's portrayed herself, that you can't just run on, I want to be president because I want to check some boxes on an arbitrary check sheet of being the first to do something. So she will actually run on a platform, and then she'll get the kind of support that you get for trying to go and be first. So a lot of women will rally to her cause because they want to see a woman president. But Tulsi herself will not have to actually say anything about being a woman president. It will be obvious. That's the thing a lot of the people in the establishment didn't get in 2016. You don't have to point out that Hillary Clinton is the first woman. It's pretty damn obvious. Everyone understands that. Anyway, the other thing is that any attacks they make on her will be a lot less effective simply because Tulsi has a lot of charisma armor. So if people really get to know her as a candidate, hear her talk, and they hear some accusations against her that are vague and seem like bullshit, they're a lot more likely to conclude that they are in fact bullshit. One such scandal is that someone in her family runs an organization that calls yoga scientific. Who gives a shit? There's also something where she has some relative, maybe her mother-in-law, running her office back in Hawaii. But that was cleared through the ethics office, but someone still wrote an article about it to try to smear Tulsi. And again, I don't think anyone gives a shit. So those are the kind of things that they've come up with so far, and they're pretty weak. So why is Tulsi Gabbard such a pariah in the eyes of the establishment? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the main thing that she did that got her national attention was leaving her position as a vice chair of the DNC, and I don't know this for certain, but I think it's pretty obvious based on what we know of the establishment that the reason why Tulsi Gabbard was in that position in the first place is because she'd been singled out as a future superstar according to the identity politics model. People looked at her, they saw someone who has military service, is young, attractive, female, and a minority, and they thought, hey, this is someone we can run and do identity politics with and possibly get some mileage out of her. She also has some charisma, so this will be cool. They didn't really know that she was an independent-minded person and a progressive. So since she's left the DNC, there have been the only articles about her in mainstream outlets have either called her unorthodox and weird, or they've been outright attack pieces. By the way, I think that the articles calling her unorthodox and weird probably help her more than anything else, really. At any rate, though, there have been a bunch of party hacks who have been trying to smear and downplay her as a serious candidate since she has gotten her name out there and people have taken notice. And I think it's very safe to say that the major obstacle to Tulsi's candidacy will be the Democratic Party itself. And it's pretty clear at this point that they're actually more hostile to Tulsi than they are to even Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. If it came down to a race between Bernie and Tulsi, the party might actually try to rig it in Bernie's favor. So that's what we're talking about when I talk about her being the enemy of the establishment. And because she is in such a doghouse with them, they would almost certainly try to rig it against her if she was in a close race. So I think that what she would need is to make it not close, to really blow it out to the point where it's obvious who's won and there's no way to deny it. However, I suspect that anti-establishment sentiment will be running high in 2020, especially given that there's a reasonably strong likelihood of an economic collapse the next year or so. So if that happens, people will really blame the establishment. At this point, I don't know anybody who still thinks that Hillary Clinton's loss is the property of anyone other than Hillary Clinton. So anything that Donald Trump does, you can, in many ways, blame on Hillary Clinton for losing to Donald Trump in the most winnable election of all time. So anyway, if this anti-establishment sentiment is as high as I suspect it will be, then Tulsi will really be able to capitalize on that as someone who is clearly not friends with anyone in the establishment. And if that's the case, and say if Bernie's not running, well, Tulsi really takes off, and she might become unstoppable pretty quickly if she can get her message out and get the name recognition up. There's a group based in Ohio of Arab Americans who are interested in informing Congress people about conditions in the Middle East, and they invited Tulsi Gabbard to take a trip to Syria to do her own fact-finding. And Tulsi Gabbard was the only person in Congress who accepted this invitation, so she went with this group into Syria. And in the course of her tour there, she had an opportunity to meet with Assad, and she took it. And this stirred up controversy. So after she met with Assad, this meeting resulted in a lot of articles coming out smearing her. She was accused of meeting illegally because she hadn't informed House leadership of her intentions, something that actually happens quite a bit, but no one ever gets called on, by the way. And the accusation is basically that Tulsi was this young, dumb politician who got duped by a group that were Assad regime puppets, even though actually these guys were Lebanese politicians. So why would they really be Assad puppets? Assad is the dictator of Syria and can barely exercise authority within his own borders, much less in Lebanon. And also the group is located in Ohio and mostly funded by Arab Americans. So, the whole accusation is a little bit overwrought and ridiculous. Anyway, her position on Syria is that the American efforts at regime change are illegal and that we should instead focus on finishing off ISIS, something that I think is well in keeping with the mainstream of American opinion. Back in April of 2017, Howard Dean and Neera Tanden cheered Trump's strikes, and I imagine this year in April also they repeated their support for Trump's attacks. And during this smear job over the summer of 2017, both Dean and Tanden called for voters in Hawaii to oust Gabbard. However, I seriously doubt that voters in Hawaii are more concerned with the opinions of fake progressive Neera Tanden than they are with their representative Tulsi Gabbard. Most of Tulsi's reputation for being unorthodox comes from her social conservative start and for her foreign policy. So let's take a look at her foreign policy because it's distinctive and interesting, and I think that it would give her a major edge in a primary fight if her foreign policy were allowed to speak for itself rather than being presented by neoliberals who are just there to smear her. So her foreign policy really puts her at odds with the rest of her party simply because she is a lot less hawkish and aggressive across the board than everyone else in her party, and that includes the progressives. Her stances are very likely to go over well with the public, however, since right now very few people approve of intervention in Syria, our continued presence in Iraq and Afghanistan, and most people are ready to be done with our involvement in any kind of regime change. And if Tulsi Gabbard were to present her case, then it would turn out that the majority of people are more with her than they are with the mainstream of the Democratic Party. She also criticized Obama for not using the phrase radical Islam, and this drew some hatred from neoliberals who then compared her to a Republican and said that maybe she's just a secret Republican and that the people of Hawaii are being hoodwinked by this person pretending to be a Democrat. Yet another ridiculous hit job that was horribly botched. Tulsi calls for the eradication of ISIS. This is a very mainstream position. Pretty much everybody agrees on this. However, she is precise in this claim. She wants to eliminate ISIS and then get out of Syria. That's something that is pretty popular with the American public, as most people do not want to overthrow Assad and then oversee regime change like we tried to do in Iraq, since that was a complete shit show. Early in Trump's administration, Tulsi had the foresight to realize that because Trump doesn't really have any set views and because he's not the most intelligent person in the world, he could be easily swayed by others. So she decided that she should try to persuade him to her positions. So she met with him and warned him about neoconservative crazies. And now that neoconservative crazies have entered his regime, we see that we're involved in Syria. It took John Bolton 1 week to get the bombs dropping. So Tulsi was right on this, and I think this is something that she can play up. She can talk about how it is important to work with your opponents no matter how much you disagree with them, because you can possibly dissuade them from doing some of the worst things they can possibly do. Unlike most Democratic politicians, Tulsi Gabbard has the balls to be critical of the United States for selling arms to Saudi Arabia. This is something that most politicians do not have the nerve to say a word about. And this is also something where the vast majority of the American people, at least the people who are aware of this happening, find this to be a deplorable state of affairs. She's against U.S. intervention in Syria, as we mentioned, and that includes the ongoing bombing campaign after the suspect gas attack being blamed on the Assad regime. She even released a tweet opposing this bombing campaign, whereas nearly all other Democrats, including progressives, basically said, well, in this case there was a gas attack, so I guess it's okay. But Tulsi was saying, no, we don't need to get involved in this, it's not our business. So I feel like she is distinctive in her foreign policy, and that while this puts her more at odds with the establishment, this is also something that would really appeal to voters, both within and without the Democratic Party. One major factor in determining elections of all kinds, whether primaries or generals, is what the public mood is going into that year. Because the public mood really is a good reflection of what the people want at that time and what they look for in a candidate. So there are 3 factors that I've identified that if they are prominent in 2020, they will help Tulsi Gabbard to a great degree. The first one is that if anti-war sentiments become more prominent over the next year or so, then at that point Tulsi Gabbard becomes the strongest candidate to take advantage of that particular sentiment. She has a strong record of being anti-war. She's been very consistent on that. And she also has a military background which will enable her to take those positions of being anti-war without really being hit for them, the same way that someone without that background could easily be hit for being a coward or being naive or what have you. And since Donald Trump is now the face of Syrian intervention, and he's not very popular, especially with the Democratic base, I think it's not implausible that people will be looking for someone who is less hawkish than average. It's also very possible, and I would say very likely, that the establishment will still be in the people's doghouse in 2020. So in that case, Tulsi Gabbard's pariah status could end up being an asset. If people know that the establishment hates her and they hate the establishment, then by extension, she might be pretty cool. So that might actually help her. And of course, given how on the out she is with the establishment, if she wins, she'll have to win pretty big. So again, that's the major obstacle, is that the establishment absolutely despises her. But that could turn out to be an advantage if she plays it right and if the public is as against the establishment as I think they will still be. The third thing is that I think that this backlash against political correctness will continue. People just aren't buying into it. It's not something that people want by and large, and that includes a lot of Democrats. So the thing is with Tulsi, because she took a late embrace of all of these standard Democratic social positions, and her focus has always been on economic and foreign policy issues, I really think that that will pay dividends, because she will not be labeled as an SJW. There's nothing in her record which points to that. She doesn't talk all the time about being a woman or anything like that. So I think that just by her not saying much about that, she will be identified early by people who are against SJW-esque issues and candidates as someone they can trust. So I think that she will be able to win over support that way. And since a lot of that SJW stuff is what turns off people to Democrats in general, that might be a handicap under which Tulsi does not have to operate as compared with other Democrats going into a general election. And speaking of general elections, let's look at what would happen if she were nominated. So if we look at Tulsi's prospects in a general election, I think that of all the candidates, she would have the easiest path to the White House. And I think that a lot of that is simply because she forms the starkest possible contrast with Donald Trump. Two things to say about the idea of contrast. One is that Democrats do better when there's a stark contrast between them and the Republicans. When things are indistinct and muddled, as they were in 2000 or 2004, or 2016, in that case, Democrats tend to struggle. They don't do well when they don't run on strong issues that separate them from the competition. Another thing about contrast is that if you look at the characteristics that presidents had and their perceived flaws, their successors tend to make up for those perceived flaws. So, for instance, Bill Clinton was seen as loose and immoral. George W. Bush was a stick in the mud, but he was also seen as a complete dumbass. Obama was very smart, but he was aloof and sometimes unapproachable. Trump is anything but aloof. So people would want someone who, unlike Trump, is smart and has ideas, is his own person, stuff like that. So if we look at it from that perspective, Tulsi Gabbard is 100% her own woman. There's no question about that. She answers to no one. We also look at her from an optical perspective and a policy perspective, and we see that she's a young ethnic female with a winning personality. Everybody considers her to be very nice. She has military experience. Her views are unique and based on her own research and fact-finding. She doesn't necessarily follow trends. So when all the other politicians endorsed Hillary, she actually left a position of power within the DNC to endorse Bernie. So she is the opposite of Trump in almost every possible way. You can't imagine Trump taking a courageous stand or being very likable or serving in the military or forming views based on anything like research. So, I mean, she's a 100% polar opposite of Donald Trump. I think the combination of her progressive stances, her unorthodoxies, because a lot of people, if they are not Democrats, will look at her unorthodoxy as an asset, especially independents or, say, moderate-leaning Republicans. She has personal appeal. She has a great story. She would be the first woman president, the first Samoan American president, the first Asian American president. She'd be a lot of first. And she would also be smart enough not to just run on that like Hillary did. And she could even pick up some of the momentum Hillary had with the I'm with her thing, where people wanted to see a woman president. So she'd be able to pick up a lot of support from a whole lot of people. And this would really make her an unstoppable candidate. She also would be a good heir for Bernie Sanders, I think is also safe to say, since Bernie rallied so much support from young people, and then we have someone who's pretty young coming and taking the mantle early and taking it to the White House. So between all of those narratives really coming together and Trump's weakness most likely going into 2020, the stark contrast, I think that she would have very much a wave election, and that's why I chose to show her surfing. So, my concluding thoughts on Tulsi Gabbard in 2020. Her political viability is massively underestimated by most people, and of all the dark horse candidates, she's potentially the most explosive. If she were to catch on a little bit, she could potentially ride that all the way to the White House. So, the conditions that would really help her are if Bernie doesn't run or leaves the race early, preferably before the voting starts. In that case, Tulsi Gabbard, with her charisma and her resume, will be in a strong position to take up the progressive mantle. I think that her charisma would put her ahead of people like Sherrod Brown and Elizabeth Warren. And this is assuming that she has enough time to get just enough name recognition to edge them out, of course. Her unorthodox views and actions are probably a strength. I think at this point people recognize that the old ways of doing politics are simply not working, and that the so-called resistance has only enabled Trump to cut taxes for the wealthy and bomb Syria. Her anti-war stances might make her an establishment pariah, but they do make her a hero to the left. The left has historically been an anti-war movement, and Gabbard's anti-war stances really can revitalize that. So I feel like she can tap into something that a lot of candidates are not really tapping into. Now, the biggest obstacle to her winning the nomination, of course, is that she has to combat the party apparatus, and that will require her to win by a big margin. And that is going to be very difficult. So I would never call Tulsi the favorite just because having to do that is a very difficult task. However, she has the traits and the positions to pull it off. So even though it might look impossible, I don't think it is. And I think that anyone who is looking at the 2020 race has to consider Tulsi to be one of the major players if she decides to run. So she's not a joke like Mitch Landrieu or Tim Kaine or somebody like that. If she runs, she has a very real possibility of catching fire and winning the whole thing. And as I said, if she gets in a general election, especially if she takes someone like Sherrod Brown as her running mate to give her some experience and some Midwestern labor backing, I mean, at that point, she becomes completely unbeatable. So anyway, those are my thoughts on Tulsi Gabbard.